Good afternoon and welcome to the latest Tundra Connections webcast live from Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Western Hudson Bay. We are just outside of Churchill, Manitoba right now, and we have a sleeping polar bear outside the window. He's been taking a great long bear nap all morning, pretty much. We also saw an Arctic fox kind of hop on by and check out the polar bear, and it's been a really lovely morning today on the Tundra, and we are so excited to share it with you. So we are doing an educational webcast today. Thank you so much for joining. The topic of today's webcast is trash talk, the impacts of human garbage on polar bears, a very interesting subject and one that is an increasing concern across the Arctic. I am Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International. I'm one of the staff scientists, and I'm happy to host this webcast today with you. And I would love to encourage you to please send in your questions. If we are talking about something today that you want to know more about, we would love it if you could pop your questions in the chat window. Whether you are watching this on the Tundra Connections page on the polarbearsinternational.org website, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on explore.org, we have people keeping an eye on the questions, so shoot them over and I'll try to answer them live today. We're going to talk for about 30 minutes, depending on how many questions we get, and share some interesting stories and insights about what trash is doing to polar bears in different areas of the world. I am joined by a special guest of ours here today, someone who has a very long history studying polar bears, Dr. Evan Richardson. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Hi everybody, my name is Evan Richardson. I'm a polar bear research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada in the Science and Technology branch. I'm one of two federal polar bear research scientists here in Canada, and I've been fortunate enough to be working here in Western Hudson Bay for the last 20 years, studying bears around Churchill, Manitoba, understanding their ecology, understanding some of the threats that they face with climate change. And I'm here today with Elisa to talk about the importance of understanding human waste and garbage and human bear conflicts.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. And again, please send us your questions anytime throughout the broadcast. So first, let's kind of set the scene. We'll give you some context and back up a little. First, we need to know where polar bears even live. So you just heard both Evan and I mention Western Hudson Bay. The Western Hudson Bay subpopulation of polar bears is the ones that we're looking at today outside the buggy. So these are the bears near Churchill. But they are only one of 19 different subpopulations around the Arctic. Evan, would you be able to explain a little bit about where polar bears live and why they live there?
Absolutely. So polar bears have a circumpolar distribution around the Arctic. They're located in 5 different countries: Canada, US, Russia, Denmark, and Norway. There's around 25,000 polar bears worldwide, but their distribution is really restricted by where sea ice forms every year. And so we find bears are distributed fairly ubiquitously across areas where sea ice is available, and they like to spend their time over areas of a shallow continental shelf. Those areas tend to have more biological productivity. They support larger numbers of seals, and then obviously that's food for the bears. So they like to be where the food is at. And so in places like Western Hudson Bay here, the ice actually melts in the summer, and bears spend quite a bit of time on land. And so that's when they have the potential to come into contact with humans.
Right, so you mentioned, of course, polar bears need Arctic sea ice. This is an ice bear. This is an animal that's completely adapted to this marine Arctic sea ice environment. This animal would rather not be on land if they didn't have to be. In fact, we were just talking today, as soon as the ice does freeze here in Hudson Bay, it's been ice-free all summer, too warm. It's going to freeze soon, and as soon as there's enough ice here, these bears will be gone. That's why our viewing window in October and November is pretty short, because those bears are gone out on the sea ice as soon as they can. But something that's happening in different areas across the Arctic is that we are losing Arctic sea ice. As we're burning fossil fuels, we're releasing heat-trapping emissions into the atmosphere. These act like a heat-trapping blanket around the Earth, and we're burning too many fossil fuels, we're releasing too many emissions, and we are thickening this heat-trapping blanket. And of course, ice doesn't like heat, so we're starting to see a loss of sea ice in some areas already, and that loss of sea ice has translated into a loss of polar bears in some regions, including this one. And maybe, Evan, you could talk a little bit about why the sea ice declining is impacting the polar bears.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about climate change and loss of sea ice, I mean, it's basically loss of polar bear critical habitat. The bears use the sea ice as a platform from which to hunt their primary prey, ring seals and bearded seals. And when the ice melts and the seals are swimming around open water, the bears just aren't fast enough to catch seals. So they swim ashore, and then they spend their summers on land here fasting and living off their stored body reserves. They lose around 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of body weight every day just sitting around when they're waiting for the ice to come back. And so what we're seeing with global warming and climate change is the amount of time the bears are spending on the ice feeding on seals is getting smaller, and the amount of time they have to fast on land is getting greater. And so in really early sea ice breakup years, the bears come ashore in leaner body condition. They have less body fat on their bodies. And so, in really lean years, that's when we tend to see more human polar bear conflicts in places like Churchill, Manitoba, where they look at protecting people in the community. They have a whole program called the Polar Bear Alert Program that helps try and mitigate negative human polar bear conflicts. But we've been able to show with scientific data, if the ice breaks up really early and doesn't form till really late, they have more of these problem bear occurrences in towns.
Yeah, on average, these bears in this area are spending about 1 extra day a year on land. And so you can imagine that's adding up over time. And we've mentioned polar bears need to eat seals. Their main food is seal blubber, and that's a very filling food that gives them a lot of energy. So when they are stuck on land longer, even though they'd rather eat a seal, they're still a bear. They're really hungry. They're going to follow their noses. They're going to fill their tummies with whatever they can find. And that's how they get into trouble, and then people can get into trouble too. People don't want polar bears in their communities. It's dangerous for both species, but this is something that we're seeing increasing around the Arctic, and particularly in places already in Canada where the sea ice has changed a little bit. So what we are going to do, we're going to give you a couple case studies or examples of places that have experienced polar bears in a different way, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about what we can do for solutions for helping support human polar bear coexistence. But first, we're going to get some examples here. We are polar bear outside's picking his head up and looking around. Maybe we can show him real quick. We have thanks to BJ Kershaw for behind the scenes for mixing this program together. We'll give you a quick look at that polar bear. And while we're looking at the polar bear at some point, I'll throw to Evan. Evan, maybe you could start with the example. You were talking about it last night, actually. An example that our chief scientist, Steve Amstrup, had written about a long time ago. What's going on with polar bears when they kind of get into food they're not supposed to get into? What happens to them?
Absolutely. So polar bears make a living off marine mammal blubber and fat, and they're really attracted to anything that's sort of oily. And so sometimes when they come into human settlements, and in particular open pit dumps, they can get into garbage. And some of the things that bears eat, like they might lick motor oil out of a can. There was an instance where they consumed antifreeze, which was really bad for the bear. Things like batteries. There's other garbage that they can eat, plastic bags and things that can get caught up in their digestive system. And so there's a lot of potential health impacts for bears when they're eating garbage, and then also the additional potential for negative interactions with people if they're getting into somebody's garbage close to their home, or coming into a community to potentially attract in like dog food or something like that. It can create a lot of issues. So we need to try and mitigate those as best we can, because the polar bears are already dealing with lots of their issues with climate change and contaminants and other threats to the species. And so this is something we can actually manage if we put our minds to it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. As we work to fix climate change and get our emissions under control, we know polar bears will be impacted, so it's important that we keep as many wild polar bears in the wild as possible while we work to address their main threat, climate change. And part of keeping them in the wild is helping, again, support this human polar bear coexistence and keep polar bears out of communities. And Evan, last night you were talking about something so interesting about the polar bears' stomachs and the way that they digest food, and how the way they digest food is definitely not made to eat quantities of garbage or anything that's not really seal blubber.
Yeah, and so polar bears can consume a lot of food at one time. They can consume over 100 pounds of seal blubber and meat in a single sitting, and so they have these amazingly large stomachs to store all this food. But in order to have a high digestive efficiency for it, they have this really small opening between their stomach and their large intestine. And so that allows them and gives them time to break down the lipids, to absorb them into their body, and keep that large volume of food from just going straight through the bear. And so, but because they have that small opening, it's prone to getting in blockages, and particularly from foreign bodies like plastic bags or towels or things that have been covered in something the bear might like to eat. And so there's been cases in Alaska where they've done necropsies on bears that have passed away, and actually looked and found these blockages in polar bear stomachs. And so once you have a blockage in your stomach, that's it. Unless us, we can go to a doctor. If it happens with your dog, you take it to the vet. But a wild polar bear, if they get into that situation, there's really no help for them.
And we just got a question right in that vein. If the polar bears do get sick from eating things they shouldn't, is there a wildlife vet that could help them?
Yeah, I mean, if we knew that was what the problem was, there might be a potential to intervene. But quite often you just kind of see a bear that looks sick, and you don't know what the issue is. You don't know if they maybe are exposed to a pathogen, or maybe they're just injured, or maybe they're just tired and old. And so typically we don't intervene in those types of situations because you really don't know what the issue is. And being able to work on polar bears in wild situations is pretty difficult. We can't just drag them out of the wild here into a facility where we can have all the things we need to safely anesthetize them and give them a full body workover. And you'd have to scope their stomachs if it was a blockage or things like that. And so unfortunately we just don't have those toolkits in really remote areas of the Arctic where they could be applied on polar bears.
Yeah, another reason it's important to manage our waste and manage climate change and keep polar bears away from it in the first place. Let's take a look at a couple specific examples of when polar bears are coming too close for comfort to communities. And let's start in Kaktovik in Alaska. There was, I should say, a lot of this webcast today, it is based on a paper that was published in Oryx, the journal Oryx, and Evan was a co-author on that paper, and that paper kind of goes through different examples of polar bears getting into attractants that they shouldn't, and one of these examples, again, was Kaktovik in Alaska. Evan, what is going on in Kaktovik with people and polar bears?
Yeah, so the situation in Kaktovik's somewhat unique in terms of the fact that they harvest these large bowhead whales, and they bring the whales onto the beach close to the community, and they harvest the whales for subsistence use, and people consume the whales. But there is some leftover, internal organs, things like that from the whales. And polar bears are obviously attracted to that because they do consume marine mammals, and so it acts as an attractant in the community. And actually, throughout the Arctic, where we have indigenous peoples that rely on marine mammals for food, there's always that potential. And so people bring food back to the community where they live, and they consume it. And quite often they process their food on the beach and deal with it that way. And so polar bears are attracted to those smells, and it has the potential to draw bears into communities. And then obviously when bears and people get too close, you can have conflict. So
absolutely. So that's one example, and that's an interesting one of it kind of starting from a subsistence hunt anyway, and how do you manage these increasing polar bears. And we should say too that the sea ice in the southern Beaufort Sea in that area has changed so much that there are more bears, it seems like, coming to land to those whalebone piles, and that's kind of exacerbating this issue up there. Let's take a little hop over the high Arctic into Russia. And Russia's been in the news, well, I think the last few years there's been kind of polar bears kind of coming into different areas. There's a case study in this research paper I mentioned about Russian polar bears. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the Russia situation.
Yeah, and again, the Russia situation is something we see here in Canada as well, and other places around the circumpolar Arctic, and that's polar bears being attracted to unmanaged human waste and garbage. And so in a lot of places in the Arctic, they just have open pit dumps. I mean, similar to southern latitudes. But particularly in Russia, I mean, they seem to have a little bit of a waste management a problem in some of these Arctic communities, because they're remote and maybe aren't, well funded enough. And so there's been several communities that have had polar bears essentially kind of group there en masse and start going through the garbage, and you might have seen some of the video of the bears like basically waiting for the garbage trucks to back up and dump out the waste from the community, and so that results in food habituation of bears. And so basically in layman's terms, that means bears just start associating food with people, and so when they start making that association, then they're more likely to interact with people. And when you're talking about a large land carnivore like polar bears, that's not only dangerous for people but also dangerous for bears, because sometimes people respond in negative ways for the bears. So.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we could also maybe, to give you even more context about polar bear diets, so again, polar bears want to eat seals and seal blubber, and they're a fat adapted species, and large part of that is that it's so hard to live in the Arctic. This is the biggest bear species, and seal blubber has the most calories. There's nothing on the terrestrial landscape, and especially not human garbage, that compares energetically to seal blubber.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, blubber has high caloric value. That's what polar bears have adapted to use. They left the terrestrial environment, several 100,000 years ago when they evolved from brown bears, and really kind of evolved to make use of the high caloric fat resources of marine mammals.
Mm-hmm. So let's come on back to Canada for a minute, where we are here. I want to talk a little bit about some of our efforts in Churchill, Manitoba. So Churchill is sometimes called the polar bear capital of the world. And Churchill is arguably the best setup in the world to handle wild polar bears. Evan already mentioned the Polar Bear Alert program that Churchill has. It is unique in the world for dealing with bears that come into the community. Polar Bear Alert, they're set up to move bears away, to actually transport them, fly them by helicopter away if needed. There's even a holding facility here in Churchill that if a bear is particularly coming back to town too much, they can put it in the holding facility until the ice comes back and they'll release the bear. They have all these really incredible resources for handling polar bears. But if we back up a few decades ago, it looked different in Churchill. And I don't know if Evan, if you're able to speak about kind of the dump days in Churchill when there was an open garbage dump here.
Yeah, absolutely. Churchill, had this history of having an open dump, which a lot of northern communities still do have, and bears would get into the dump. They'd be attracted to the garbage that was put there, the household meals that were thrown out and expired food from the grocery store and things like that. And there were bears that were habituated to coming to the dump. There was a famous bear called Linda who came to the dump, always with her cubs, and then her cubs in turn ended up being problem bears as well. And so you kind of have this cycle of learning that can happen in polar bears, where moms teach their cubs about where to go look for food, and if they're looking for food in dumps, then that's not a good thing for the bears. And so, but Churchill, Manitoba took the step to actually close down the dump. They closed down the dump in the mid-2000s, and developed this waste transfer station. So all the garbage in the community goes to this locked building where the bears can't get in, they can't get access to it. And so that's resulted in fewer bears having to be dealt with by the Polar Bear Alert program, because at one point they kind of had a zero tolerance policy for bears in the dump, because they knew bears that get into the dump are more likely to come into the community looking for food. And so they shut it down, and it's made a big difference for the community here.
Absolutely. One question here: are polar bears ever aggressive toward people?
Yeah, polar bears can be aggressive towards people. In particularly bears that are food stressed are more often than not the ones that get into trouble. And so when we start to push these bears to their physiological limits, when they start to get really lean, they want to survive just like every other species on the planet. And if that means they have to chase a human away from a food source that they may have at a barbecue or something, or an Inuit hunter that's working on a subsistence harvested whale or seal, they'll if they're desperate, they'll pursue those interactions to get the energy that they need to survive.
Absolutely. So again, Churchill's been kind of on the forefront of a lot of these polar bear safe ideas. And in fact, Churchill's currently working to become the world's first recognized polar bear safe community. This isn't something that really exists yet, but we think it should, and Churchill's the absolute best place to kick something like that off. The idea is that if Churchill can show there's a wide range of ways we can deal with polar bears, that we can coexist with polar bears, other communities across the Arctic could use examples from Churchill to model themselves on as they start dealing with increasing polar bears as well. And there's quite a few different solutions that are available to us. Some are easier than others, but it's important that we continue to work to empower communities across the north to deal with polar bears and to coexist with polar bears how they want to. Every place is a little bit different culturally, geographically, with sea ice patterns, with the number of polar bears. So there's no one size fits all solution, but there are some things we can talk about big picture. One of the biggest ones is education. Talking to people in communities about polar bears, what's going on. And in Churchill, we find particularly talking to visitors. So Churchill is a major tourist destination for polar bears. And when you have people coming in from all over the world that desperately want to take the best picture of a polar bear, they might be willing to do things that they shouldn't. That's not safe for them or for the bear. And so educating people about the best way to exist with polar bears, to respect the polar bear, particularly if they're tourists just visiting, and teaching them about the town and the town's culture on how to be with the bear, that's really important. That's one thing. Another way to educate, of course, is to talk to youth, talk to kids. And one example of something we've done is we worked with the provincial government here and we created a polar bear safe coloring book for kids. We've gone on to expand versions of that coloring book around the Arctic, and we have many more to come. We currently have a version for Churchill, of course, and we have one for Russia and one for Greenland that's translated into a few different languages altogether. So it's a really great way just to talk to kids. Hey, this is what a polar bear is. It's got some basic information. And then one thing we've done in this book is we've tailored the pictures, some pictures in each book, to that community. So those kids can see their own playground in that community. They can see their own landscape, and they're much more likely to envision themselves in these places and envision themselves being safe, being polar bear safe at their playground. So I probably a lot of you don't have to worry about polar bears on the playground, but some students do, and let's support them in kind of knowing what's going on and how to be safe out there. Some other kind of low-tech options, some people have dogs. Pet dogs are a great alarm system. Dogs are very common across the north, that's one thing. We also say things like carry bear spray with you. Bear spray is very effective on bears, even polar bears. So if people are visiting the north and they're out in polar bear country, we make sure they have bear spray and they know how to use it safely, and that's a good thing. So that's just a safety measure. It's much better to spray a polar bear than to have to use even more force, so that's a good option. But the number one thing and what we're talking about today, one of the best things people can do is manage attractants and manage garbage. And we mentioned that a few times already. Evan kind of talked about how Churchill has taken these huge steps to manage their garbage, but we can go even further. And so another thing that we've supported in Churchill, and this has been a town effort, so Polar Bears International is involved, but this is a town effort with the Churchill Polar Bear Smart Working Group that has stakeholders from a variety of folks around town. We've got local government, we've got provincial government, we've got tourist companies, a bunch of different people working together to support people and polar bears and ultimately the conservation of polar bears. One thing we've done is install bear-proof garbage bins around Churchill. And bear-proof garbage bins, those are pretty common in a lot of areas in Canada. In Jasper and Banff, there's black bears and brown bears, and bears just like sniffing out garbage, but it takes a little bit of an extra bin to withstand a polar bear, but they're very, very effective. And in fact, so far, the only example that we have of a polar bear at one of these bins in Churchill was when the bin, it was full of fish guts. Someone had just caught some fish and cleaned them, and the bin wasn't closed properly. And so the polar bear got in there. But so far, it has really cut down the amount of bears coming in looking for garbage and really cut down the amount of bears being rewarded for looking for garbage. So those are really, really important things. Another place in the world that we're working on expanding efforts is southern Hudson Bay. So if you go down the coast here, down to Ontario, northern Ontario, there's polar bears down there that are also starting to spend a bit more time on land. And we're working with multiple communities, going slow, kind of seeing what they need, what they want, what's going to work for them, and just supporting them in their efforts to kind of keep themselves safe and maybe manage attractants in different ways. And one thing that we've also just been able to do is support training. So trainings of folks, here's how you can move a polar bear away from your town. And one of the best things we can do is just help connect people. So we can help connect Churchillians who deal with polar bears often to folks in other areas, and have the Churchillians talk to these other communities about what works for them, and just support the sharing of knowledge. That is so, so important. So I've got a couple more questions for you. Is it super common for the polar bears to come into town? Would you say it's a common thing?
Yeah, I mean, common can be a bit of a vague term, but in some years, the Manitoba Polar Bear Alert Program can handle, 40, 50, 60, 70 polar bears. So, wow. I mean, it's, can be, a large percentage of the population. You're talking, up to, 5 to 8% of the population might be conflict bears in really polar sea ice years. And so I would say that's fairly common. And I mean, one of the unique things about Churchill is it's on this migratory sort of corridor for the bears. So the bears are slowly moving northward throughout the ice-free season to kind of meet up with the first sea ice that forms here in western Hudson Bay. And so they kind of naturally, migrate towards and go past Churchill, Manitoba. And so that just kind of puts them on a path to interact with people in the community sometimes.
Yeah, thanks for answering that one. I don't know if I think you can answer this one. You've been here long enough working with polar bears for 20 years near Churchill. How do we celebrate Halloween up here? It's always a great question because, of course, Halloween, kids are out trick-or-treating. There's polar bears. What do we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, up here, Halloween is basically a whole town affair. And so the community really coordinates and, rallies together and, puts observers all over town, around town at like varying distances. And kind of essentially have their eyes open all day and into the evening when the kids are getting ready to do their trick-or-treating. And, they kind of really work together to make sure that, no bears get into town while everybody's running around and doing their trick-or-treating, and to make sure everything's safe for the kids and for the bears.
Yeah, and we're sure excited to celebrate Halloween safely next week. It is always a blast in Churchill. Well, if you have any more questions, you have one more minute to pop them in, but I will start wrapping up here. We've been talking for almost half an hour. We've covered some really fabulous information, talking about the importance of managing waste and human garbage to help protect polar bears and people. For most of us, we don't deal with polar bears on a day-to-day basis. For most people in the world, when you think of polar bears, you imagine an animal that's pretty remote and far away, and it might be nice to see one day. But for many people across the Arctic, they are a day-to-day reality, especially in the fall or the summer. And they're not a cute and fuzzy animal. They can be something that is kind of dangerous if it gets too close. So while we work to keep polar bears in the wild and work to address climate change and reduce our emissions, we want to be supporting these communities, keeping themselves safe, making sure they have lots of options and they're supported and kind of dealing with this issue. It's another one of those things that these northern communities did not contribute to climate change nearly at all like the South did, but now they're dealing with all these kind of extra ramifications or consequences of climate change. So we're going to keep working on this topic for years to come. It will be something I bet you hear more about, and Churchill is the absolute best place to kind of be and to test things and try things out and to communicate efforts from, because Churchill truly is on the forefront as people deal with rising polar bear like presence all across the Arctic. So we don't have any more questions coming in, so I will start my wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really had a good time talking about trash talk. Thank you so much, Evan, for being here. Please, if you're a teacher or a parent, check out our website. We have lots of units and lesson plans available. We've got math, we've got kind of art stuff, we've got a bunch of different things that you can use in your classroom. We also have a feedback survey. We would love it if you would give us your feedback on some of the materials we have so that we can improve them for you. Big thank you to explore.org. They are helping us run these polar bear cams across the tundra. We are on Buggy 1 today with the Buggy 1 cam, but there's other polar bear cams spread out through the area, as well as a Northern Lights cam. The Northern Lights were amazing last night.
Yeah, phenomenal.
Phenomenal. And also beluga cams in the summer. And also big thanks to Frontiers North Adventures, who lend us Buggy 1 all fall so that we can do this with you. Huge partner of ours. We could not be doing this without them. Thank you to the viewers. If you're also interested in Buggy 1 and want one of your own, we are trying to get a Lego Buggy 1 created. So we have a contest online. You can vote for Buggy 1 to become a Lego kit. If you're interested in that, please vote and follow us on the Lego website. It would be a really neat way to even talk about polar bears and polar bear conservation to a greater extent. We're going to finish by playing one more video for you. Please hang on, and it's a lot of ways you can get involved, but one of the best things you can do is just to talk about it. Talk about polar bears, talk about what you're interested in, talk about what you learned today with your friends and family, and please stay tuned for the rest of the fall. We will be coming to you with even more broadcasts and more beautiful polar bear action until the polar bears get the sea ice back and they leave us overnight. So Thanks again, and enjoy this video, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from, because together we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.